Under the care of grandfather Abdul Muttalib, covering the early life of Prophet Muhammad after the passing of his mother, Amina, in the quiet stillness of the valleys surrounding Mecca, a city both ancient and alive with the rhythms of trade and tradition, a small caravan wound its way homeward. Among its travelers, a woman carried grief deeper than the sands beneath her feet. Amina bint Wahb had set out with her only child, the young Muhammad, to visit Yathrib, the resting place of her husband Abdullah, whom she had loved yet barely known. The journey had been intended to connect her son to the memory of his late father, to show him where his roots lay, to wrap him, even if only by memory, in the presence of a man whose embrace he would never know. But on their return, Amina fell gravely ill near the village of Alabwa. Her strength waned as the days passed, the desert offering no mercy. With tender eyes, she gazed at her son, a boy not yet 6, whose innocence was untouched by the weight of the world, yet whose destiny would one day carry it. In her final moments, she is said to have whispered words of love, perhaps prayers, perhaps hopes that the one who had taken her husband would now protect their son. And there, in the desolation of Alabwa, Amina passed away, leaving Muhammad an orphan in the most complete sense of the word. From that place of loss, the caravan returned to Mecca with the child. At just 6 years old, Muhammad had now lost both parents. In the culture of Quraysh, lineage and guardianship were of profound importance. A child's identity and security were deeply tied to the protection and standing of his family. And so it was that the boy came under the guardianship of his paternal grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, the aging but deeply respected chief of Banu Hashim. Abdul Muttalib, known for his noble character and dignified presence, was not a man untouched by grief himself. He had seen children and grandchildren come into the world, and he had buried loved ones too. Yet when young Muhammad was placed in his care, something profound stirred in the old man's heart. Whether it was compassion for the grandson of his beloved son Abdullah, or a deeper, almost prophetic sense of the child's future, Abdul Muttalib cherished Muhammad with a love that was both gentle and fiercely protective. They say that among the chieftains of Mecca, Abdul Muttalib was marked by wisdom and generosity. His presence commanded respect without the need for loud words. In the heat of the day, he would sit near the Kaaba, under the shade of a great canopy reserved only for him. His sons would stand respectfully around him, and no one dared to sit in his place. Yet the young Muhammad, in his innocence, would walk straight to his grandfather's spot and settle beside him, or even upon the very carpet that none else would dare approach. The other sons would try to gently pull the boy away, but Abdul Muttalib would stop them, his voice softened by affection. "Leave my grandson," he would say. "By Allah, he is destined for greatness." And so, the elders of Quraysh began to notice. There was something different about this child. Muhammad grew under this loving gaze, learning by watching rather than being directly taught. Abdul Muttalib was a man of principles, generous too. The pilgrims who came to Mecca and protective of the sacred trust of the Kaaba. He had once famously pledged to sacrifice one of his own sons, if Allah blessed him with 10. And after drawing lots, the choice fell on Abdullah's father. But Allah's mercy came through the advice of the Quraysh, who suggested ransoming Abdullah with camels instead, thus sparing his life. These stories were part of the family's living memory, stories that shaped the very sense of destiny surrounding Muhammad. In those years, Muhammad was often seen by his grandfather's side. When Abdul Muttalib attended meetings with the Quraysh, the boy would sometimes follow, observing the discussions about trade caravans, alliances, and disputes. Though young, he listened quietly, his presence gentle, yet striking. His large, dark eyes missed nothing. His silence spoke more than words. Those around Abdul Muttalib began to sense a subtle grace in the childhood dignity that belied his years. At night, the boy would return to the household of Abdul Muttalib. Though the family was large, Muhammad was given particular care. The loss of his parents could have left him vulnerable, but under his grandfather's protection, he found love that softened the pain. There was no replacement for a mother's embrace, yet the kindness of Abdul Muttalib offered warmth and safety. But time, as always, moved forward. The boy was only 8 years old when Abdul Muttalib, now frail and weighed down by age, felt his own life drawing to a close. In his final days, Abdul Muttalib's thoughts turned to the future of his grandson, who would care for Muhammad with the same tenderness. Among his sons, the one whose heart held the deepest affection for the boy was Abu Talib, the full brother of Abdullah, Muhammad's late father. As death approached, Abdul Muttalib called Abu Talib and entrusted Muhammad to his care. There was both sorrow and faith in that moment, sorrow at parting, and faith that the trust would be honored. Abu Talib, though not the wealthiest among his brothers, had a heart of exceptional kindness. He promised to guard the child as he would his own when Abdul Muttalib passed away. It was a moment of profound loss for young Muhammad. In the span of just a few years, the boy had lost mother, father, and now grandfather. Yet it was also a turning point, for the love and guardianship of Abu Talib would become a shelter that guided Muhammad through youth into the beginnings of adulthood. But in those brief 2 years under Abdul Muttalib, something essential, had been shaped in Muhammad: the dignity, the calm strength, the sense of belonging to a noble family, yet standing apart by virtue of character. All these seeds were planted in those days by the side of his grandfather. The Kaaba's shadow, the solemn meetings of Quraysh, the steady wisdom of an elder who saw in him the promise of greatness. All these became part of the boy's earliest memories. Even decades later, when Muhammad became the messenger of Allah, people would remember how Abdul Muttalib had spoken of him as special, as someone chosen. And indeed, from the eyes of that old man looking tenderly at his grandson, to the first revelation in the cave of Hira, the thread of destiny ran unbroken. In the evenings, under the wide sky of Mecca, Muhammad would sometimes sit quietly, perhaps remembering the warmth of his grandfather's embrace, the gentle voice that had called him, "My beloved grandson." Those were memories that neither time nor trial could erase. Under Abdul Muttalib's care, Muhammad learned more than customs and tribal traditions. He learned compassion, dignity, and the power of quiet strength. The city of Mecca saw him grow from an orphan child into a youth marked by honesty, a quality so pure that even his rivals later named him Alami in the trustworthy. These early years, though short, were the foundation upon which a life of mercy, truth, and patience would be built. A boy who had no father's lap to rest upon, and soon no grandfather's arm to lean on, would carry within him a resilience born not of luxury but of loss met with love. It is in this delicate balance between sorrow and care, between the emptiness left by absence and the warmth of those who stepped forward, that the early life of Muhammad unfolded. And though Abdul Muttalib did not live to see the dawn of prophethood, his love left a mark on the prophet's heart that endured beyond the limits of time. Beneath the ever-shifting skies of Mecca, life moved in its ancient rhythms. The merchants set out on their caravans by dawn. The women drew water from the wells. The children played in the dust of narrow alleyways. And pilgrims gathered around the Kaaba, seeking blessings and offering prayers. In that daily hum of life, the young Muhammad walked with quiet steps, his eyes observing more than his lips ever spoke. Though only 8 years old when Abdul Muttalib passed away, Muhammad carried from those brief years the weight of memory and the light of love. The memory was of gentle mornings by his grandfather's side, of watching the elders of Quraysh gather to discuss matters of trade and diplomacy. The light of love was a softer gift, the unspoken assurance that even as an orphan, he was cherished, seen, and valued. Those early lessons would shape a man who, decades later, would tell others to care for the orphan, to treat the weak with dignity, and to protect those whom society overlooked. When Abu Talib took Muhammad into his household, he did so not as an obligation but as an act of profound devotion. The Prophet's father, Abdullah, and Abu Talib had shared not only blood but deep brotherly affection. Born of the same mother, Fatimah bint Amr, that closeness had woven itself into Abu Talib's heart, so that caring for Muhammad felt like a sacred trust, a continuation of love for a brother long gone. Abu Talib himself was not among the wealthiest of the Quraysh. His household had mouths to feed, and though he belonged to the respected Banu Hashim clan, prosperity often eluded him. Yet in his home, Muhammad never felt like a burden. The boy was given a place at the table. His presence welcomed not his charity, but his family. Even at a young age, Muhammad felt an instinctive sense of responsibility. He saw the modest means of his uncle and wished not to add to his hardship. By the time he was a youth, he chose to share the weight of the household. Herding sheep became his first occupation, a humble task, yet one full of silent teachings. The hills around Mecca became both his workplace and his classroom. Among the scattered rocks and thorny bushes of those hills, Muhammad watched over the flocks. The days were long, the sun sometimes harsh, but he learned patience in the quiet, away from the noise of the city. He saw how the sheep responded to kindness more than harshness, how they scattered when frightened and gathered when called gently. In those solitary moments, the habits of mercy and gentle leadership began to take deeper root in his heart. Stories from these years spread among the people of Mecca. Even as a boy, he was known to speak truthfully, to never cheat nor lie. In a society where sharp dealings and clever words could bring quick profit, such honesty was rare enough to be noticed. Neighbors spoke of the boy's noble bearing, his reluctance to join other children in their playful mischief, and his kindness toward animals and the poor. Meanwhile, Abu Talib's affection for his nephew grew stronger with each passing season. When food was scarce, it is said that Muhammad would wait, allowing the younger children to eat first. Abu Talib noticed how the presence of the boy seemed to bring quiet blessings upon the household. Meals stretched further, and hardship felt lighter. These were not the miracles that would later define the life of the prophet, but they were small mercies, noticed by those who paid attention. As Muhammad grew from childhood into youth, his quiet strength and honesty began to shine more brightly. He was now tall and well-built, with eyes that seemed to look beyond appearances and words that carried weight despite being few. Among the Quraysh, even the elders began to seek his opinion on small matters. Drawn by his thoughtful nature, Abu Talib, as a respected leader of Banu Hashim, often traveled with trade caravans, carrying goods to Syria and Yemen. On one such journey, when Muhammad was around 12 years old, his uncle chose to take him along. The desert caravan, with its long procession of camels, bales of spices, and bolts of cloth, became Muhammad's next classroom. The road to Syria was more than a commercial route. It was a ribbon connecting cultures, ideas, and beliefs from across lands. Along the journey, Muhammad observed not just the trade itself, but the character of men in times of stress and temptation. In bustling markets and quiet oases, he saw the effects of greed and generosity, deceit and honesty. These were lessons that would later help him understand the hearts of people, both their frailties and their capacities for goodness. It was on this journey to Syria that, according to early traditions, something remarkable happened. The caravan stopped near the settlement of Busra, where a Christian monk named Bahira lived. Bahira had long watched the caravans pass, but on this day, he noticed a figure shaded by a cloud, a sign he recognized from his scriptures. Inviting the caravan to a meal, Bahira's attention settled on the young boy. The monk is said to have observed signs, perhaps marks between the prophet's shoulders, or perhaps the noble manner of the boy himself that stirred his heart. He questioned Abu Talib, asking about the boy's lineage. After learning that the boy's father had died before his birth, Bahira urged Abu Talib to protect his nephew, warning that some among the people of the book might recognize in him the signs of prophethood and wish him harm. This episode, recorded in early Islamic tradition, left a deep impression. For Muhammad, the journey was another step in understanding the wider world beyond Mecca, the diverse beliefs of its people, and the fragile balance of human hope and fear. Returning to Mecca, Muhammad resumed his quiet life, but with each passing year, his character grew clearer to those around him. He was known never to utter a false word, never to betray a trust, and never to insult or mock. His honesty in trade became so renowned that merchants sought him as a partner, knowing that profit gained through honesty, though perhaps slower, would be steady and blessed. It was during these years that Muhammad earned the title Al-Amin, the trustworthy. This title was not given lightly. In a society that valued tribal loyalty above all, for a man to become known across clans for his honesty was a distinction rare and precious. Abu Talib's love for his nephew never wavered. Despite growing older and facing his own challenges, he stood as a steady shield around the boy who had become like a son to him. In public gatherings, he would often keep Muhammad near, and if anyone spoke ill or hinted at harm, Abu Talib's fierce loyalty became evident. Beyond family and trade, Muhammad found moments of reflection in the quiet places around Mecca. The mountains and caves surrounding the city were places where he could withdraw from the noise of the marketplace and the heated debates of the Quraysh. Though still young, he seemed drawn to solitude, not out of loneliness, but from a deep desire to think and understand. He saw the idols placed in and around the Kaaba, statues of stone and wood, honored by offerings and prayers. Yet in his heart, Muhammad felt no pull toward them. Something deep within whispered that worship belonged not to creations of human hands, but to the unseen creator of all. By his 20s, Muhammad had established himself as a trusted trader. Though he had little wealth of his own, his reputation opened doors. It was during this time that the wealthy and noble Khadija bint Khuwaylid, herself a respected merchant, heard of his honesty and skill. She invited him to lead her trade caravan to Syria, a journey that would mark the beginning of a partnership far greater than commerce. Yet all of this, the trust of Khadija, the future revelation, the years of prophethood, found part of its foundation in those earliest days under Abdul Muttalib's care. The old man, who had sat in the shade by the Kaaba with his grandson by his side, had planted seeds of confidence and belonging in a heart that had already known too much loss. Those who knew Muhammad as a child would later recall the tenderness of Abdul Muttalib, the protective watch of Abu Talib, and the quiet nobility that seemed to surround the boy from his earliest days. Together, these guardians shaped not just his external life, but the inward compass that would guide him through storms far greater than the loss of loved ones. In this way, the boy who once sat on his grandfather's carpet by the Kaaba grew into a man whose truthfulness would move nations, whose mercy would soften hearts hardened by centuries of tribal pride, and whose message would cross deserts, seas, and centuries. The desert winds that had once whispered through the tents of Abdul Muttalib carried forward stories of a grandson loved beyond measure, and a grandfather whose vision glimpsed the dawn that few others could see. As the seasons turned, and years slipped quietly into the past, the memories of Abdul Muttalib remained deeply woven into Muhammad's heart. Though the prophet would one day carry a message that reshaped the world, the tenderness and wisdom he had absorbed from his grandfather continued to live within him, steady and silent, like the roots of a mighty tree. In the bustling alleys and stone courtyards of Mecca, the young Muhammad grew into a man whose character became his true wealth. Unlike many of his peers who chased status through tribal boasts or wealth through questionable trade, he moved with a dignity that spoke without words. This was the dignity that Abdul Muttalib had nurtured. the quiet strength of one who knew his worth lay not in gold or bloodline alone, but in truthfulness, compassion, and integrity. People noticed. Elders who had once seen the boy sitting by his grandfather's side would now see the grown man in the market and recall the gentle predictions of the past. Some remembered Abdul Muttalib's words, spoken in the calm voice of an old man who had lived long enough to see patterns others missed. This son of my son shall have a great destiny. At the time, many had smiled politely, thinking it nothing more than a grandfather's love. Yet as Muhammad matured, those words no longer seemed just the warmth of family pride. They felt like a glimpse into what was yet to come. Through his teenage years, Muhammad had continued to work alongside his uncle Abu Talib, accompanying caravans across burning deserts and through cities alive with languages, customs, and faiths. Each journey became a silent lesson: the value of fairness, the cost of greed, the universality of human hope and fear. Though young, he dealt with merchants much older, who found in him a partner they could trust without hesitation. By the time he reached 25, his reputation as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, had spread beyond Mecca's walls. It reached the ears of Khadija bint Khuwailid, a woman of wealth and noble standing, whose trade caravans traveled as far as Syria and Yemen. Known for her intelligence and honor, Khadija sought someone to manage her business affairs, a role that demanded not only skill but impeccable integrity. In these years, he began retreating to the cave of Hira, a small, lonely opening among the jagged rocks of Jabal al-Nur. There, in the silence of the night, beneath the infinite sky, he would reflect on life, creation, and the unseen power that guided the stars. It was an act of sukunya, longing for clarity that words could not fully express. Those nights in the cave were not only an escape from Mecca's noise, they were a return to something earlier and purer. The quiet lessons of childhood, the dignity of Abdul Muttalib, the protective kindness of Abu Talib, and the honesty he had chosen to carry like a lantern in his heart. Then in the darkness of one of those nights, came the moment that would change everything. As Muhammad sat in contemplation, the angel Jibreel appeared before him. The words that followed, Iqra, meaning read or recite, were both command and comfort. The first thread in a revelation that would continue for 23 years. Terrified and overwhelmed, Muhammad returned home, trembling. It was Khadija, his beloved wife, who wrapped him in her cloak and spoke words that steadied his soul. By Allah, Allah will never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your kin, you help the poor, you serve guests generously, and you assist those in distress. These words were not empty comfort. They were truth built upon years of witness. Khadija had seen the man shaped by loss and love, hardship and honesty. She had seen the legacy of Abdul Muttalib alive in her husband, the compassion, the nobility, the quiet strength that even fear could not destroy. As revelation continued, the message Muhammad brought challenged the very foundations of Meccan society: the worship of idols, the oppression of the weak, the pride of tribal lineage above justice and compassion. The same city that had once called him Al-Amin now turned against him. Leaders of Quraysh, fearing for their power and wealth, began to mock, threaten, and plot against him. Yet in these trials, the memory of those who had loved and protected him remained a hidden strength. The patience and dignity Abdul Muttalib had modeled, the loyalty and sacrifice of Abu Talib, the unwavering support of Khadija became pillars, supporting him as the weight of prophethood grew heavier. When the persecution intensified, it was again Abu Talib, now an old man, who stood as his shield. Despite pressure from the Quraysh, Abu Talib refused to surrender his nephew, declaring that he would protect Muhammad as long as he lived. And when Khadija passed away, followed soon by Abu Talib, the prophet felt grief that cut deeply, losing, in a short span, two of the greatest sources of love and support in his life. It was during this time that he would remember most vividly the kindness of Abdul Muttalib, the steady arms that had first held him when his mother was gone. Even though decades had passed, that early love remained like a lantern in his soul, reminding him of his worth and purpose when the world seemed to turn against him. Years later, as Islam spread beyond Mecca, and thousands began to follow his message, the prophet never forgot the simplicity and honesty taught in his youth. He remained humble, often sitting among the poor, greeting children, and sharing what little he had. The lessons Abdul Muttalib had shown in the shade of the Kaaba: dignity, compassion, and quiet strength lived on, not as distant memories, but as the living heart of the message he carried. Even at the height of his leadership in Medina, when envoys came from kings and tribes, the prophet maintained the humility of the orphan child who had once clung to his grandfather's cloak. He taught his followers to honor the weak, to care for the orphan, to speak the truth even when it hurt. In doing so, he passed on the very values that had been given to him. In this way, the story of a boy under the care of Abdul Muttalib became far more than a family memory. It became part of the moral foundation of a faith that would call people across continents and centuries to kindness, justice, and mercy. And so, in every act of compassion by a believer, in every word of truth spoken in the face of fear, and in every heart that shelters an orphan, The legacy of Abdul Muttalib quietly lives on through the grandson he loved, and through the message that grandson carried to the world. Here is the continuation of the narrative, gently bringing it toward a thoughtful close while weaving in ending reflections and points, still in the same flowing, story-like style, without headings or numbers, but clearly arriving at the heart of why those years, under Abdul Muttalib, truly mattered in the arc of the Prophet's life and message. Through all the years that followed the nights of revelation, the hardship of exile, the migration to Medina, and the building of a new community founded on faith and justice, the Prophet carried in his heart the quiet legacy of Abdul Muttalib. It was more than memory. It was an inheritance of character. Even as the leader of a growing nation, the Prophet remained marked by the humility that had first taken root under his grandfather's gentle care. Those who knew him best saw that beneath the power to move armies and inspire thousands, there remained the soul of the child once orphaned, who had learned the strength of kindness at his grandfather's side. In the last years of his life, when Mecca finally opened its gates to him, not as an outcast but as a conqueror, the Prophet chose forgiveness over vengeance. The city that had driven him out, mocked him, and plotted against him, now stood silently awaiting his judgment. But the man who entered was not a king driven by pride, nor a warrior seeking revenge. He was a messenger whose heart had been shaped long ago by compassion, mercy, and dignity, lessons that began under the loving gaze of Abdul Muttalib. In those final days, as revelation neared completion and the burden of his mission grew lighter, the Prophet continued to remind his followers of the values he had lived by from childhood: to care for the weak, to honor the trust of others, to speak the truth even against oneself, and to remember that true strength lies in gentleness and patience. When he delivered his farewell sermon at the plain of Arafat, addressing tens of thousands, his words echoed those early teachings, that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab except by piety and good deeds, that blood feuds must end, that women must be treated with kindness, and that the property and dignity of every believer is sacred. These were the universal truths that had begun as the simple but profound values taught by a grandfather to his grandson, who was then just an orphan boy in Mecca. The Prophet lived each day with an awareness of where he had come from, the valleys of Mecca, the shade of the Kaaba, and the protective arm of an old man whose faith in him had been unwavering. That deep sense of gratitude shaped how he saw himself, never as one entitled to greatness, but as a servant entrusted with a message. In his final illness, when the pain grew intense and companions wept at the thought of losing him, the Prophet spoke words of reassurance, calling them to hold fast to prayer, to treat those under their care kindly, and to stay united. Even at the threshold of death, his concern was for others, just as Abdul Muttalib had once shown concern for a little boy left without parents. As he left this world, he did so with words of prayer and remembrance of Allah on his lips, and, in the hearts of those he left behind, the memory of a man whose mercy and truthfulness had transformed not only his city, but the course of history. In the quiet stillness after his passing, those who sat and remembered his life understood that the Prophet had been shaped by hardship, but more importantly, by love. The love of a grandfather who had seen in his grandson something special, who had spoken of his greatness before anyone else dared to see it, and who had offered him shelter and dignity when he had nothing else. And so, the story of the Prophet, under the care of Abdul Muttalib, is more than a chapter of biography. It is a reminder of how small acts of love and kindness can ripple through generations, how the embrace of an old man, given to a lonely child, can become part of the legacy of a faith that teaches mercy to the world. In every moment the Prophet forgave rather than punished, spoke kindly rather than harshly, and stood firm for justice without pride. There lived the echo of Abdul Muttalib's gentle voice, the warmth of his protection, and the quiet certainty that compassion and dignity can shape not just a single life, but the destiny of all humanity.